Great. Thank you so much, Mike. And normally I would say it's an honor to be here, but I want to say I feel really lucky to be here because I don't know if you've talked to any members of the planning team. This has been oversubscribed for what, over a month now, right? So this morning, Lynn, there you are. Lynn says, you know, in our industry, so many events, we can sign up for 2 weeks in advance. But Lynn made the point, it's hard to get in here. So I feel really lucky to be here and an honor to be able to share some of the stories that we're about to talk about. So let's just level set a little bit. Raise your hand if one of the top 3 priorities in your organization is workforce. Okay, level set means we all generally want to talk about workforce. So you may then know about Great Place to Work Institute. Raise your hand if you know Great Place to Work Institute. Great. We'll talk about it more later, but these are some of the brands whose employee data we capture. And what's really exciting is that there's a new focus just on aging services. And senior living has participated wildly, and Mike called and asked if I would share some of the information that we've learned over the last few months, as well as share a story from the best practice library. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. As you can tell, I'm not shy, so if you have questions, happy to take those as well. Okay? So data is usually boring, so let's do this in the form of a game. In the last few months, we've surveyed so many employees across many of the communities here, and raise your hand to this question. In senior living, in our communities, which generation is the most engaged? Is it, we'll go through them and then we'll take a poll. A, the silent generation, born before 1946. B, baby boomers. We're gonna come back and take a poll. B, baby boomers. C, Gen X, which is 1965 to 80. D, millennials. Or E, Generation Z, the folks born after 1998, some of whom may still be living in your house. So raise your hand if it's A, the most engaged in our senior living communities.
These are workers?
These are our associates and employees in our senior living communities. Raise your hand if you think it's A. What about baby boomers? Raise your hand if it's baby boomers. Okay, we have a smattering who think it's baby boomers. What about C, Generation X? A lot of people think it's my generation. Thank you. D, millennials. Raise your hand if you think it's millennials. Okay. Wow, so far it's Gen X and millennials are winning. Raise your hand if you think it's Gen Z, those born after 1998 and after. Is it Ken? Raises his hand. Anyone else? Okay, so we have some votes here. It is Gen Z. So think about when you're 19 years old. Do you know what you want to do with your career? What's really surprising, it was a real shock to me because I thought it was Gen X or maybe baby boomers myself. The data is very clear. It's Gen Z. And it's such a surprise because many of our companies have not prepared for those conversations with the 19-year-olds, right? When you're 19 and someone has a conversation with you, it makes a huge difference on what you might do with your career, right? Part of the reason why perhaps we don't think too much about Gen Z is oftentimes these are the dining part-time students, right? And it doesn't make a difference, they're going to leave anyways, right? But actually look at this data. So we also collect turnover data. So look at, this is data on, across the bottom is the Trust Index Employee Engagement Score for each community. Each dot here is about 300 communities, and the turnover. So see how clear this pattern is? This is real data from the last 5 months. And it's basically 1 for 1. improve your trust index score 1, your turnover in the part-time servers decreases by 1%. So it's really interesting, and I'd love to share more of this information as all the data is collected. But meanwhile, we thought it would be interesting to just get to the point, which is Great Place to Work Institute has been around over 30 years. All of this data has been captured across industries. The green line here is by industry what the US Labor Bureau reports as the average turnover, and the line above that is the best companies. So the companies who rank as best companies, what their turnover is. So the takeaway here is that turnover can be halved with engaged employees. It is so important. As part of the game, we had some slides on wages. We collect that and all sorts of things. We can talk about that later, but I just wanted to get to this main takeaway. So this is really important. I'm excited that we've been doing this work for a few months now. And so as we take a book from the Great Place to Work library, thought we could learn some new ideas and get some conversations going for the rest of our time together. I wanted to introduce you to a real guy. His name is Chris, and he is an ex-cop who he got in his 20s, he was a cop, and he got hit by a car while on duty. So ended up in the hospital for a long time. He, unfortunately, once he got out, could not go back to work. So he became a security director at that hospital. So he worked his way up, and over time, Chris got to be an executive. But one memory sticks out to him. So when he was a security director, he was in the hallway, and the CEO of the company was coming down the hall. And Chris, straightened up, so excited, and the CEO walked right past him. So Chris realized that if he ever got into a place where he has influence, he was going to acknowledge everyone and not walk right past them. So that really formulated his thinking. So when he arrives at a company, this is again a true story, he arrives at a company with high turnover, labor shortages, and union risk. In fact, the CNAs at his largest site had just unionized. Sound familiar to maybe our industry? So on top of that, he has a lot of employees. He has 13,000 employees, and they're high needs employees, as measured by how many people call into the employee assistance program. On top of that, Chris, this poor guy, has $20 million in operating losses, and his customer satisfaction has tanked to below 10th percentile. So you get the picture? He gets appointed CEO. So if you were Chris, what would you do? Mark says he would resign right away.
Look for a new job.
Look for a new job. What would you do? So a lot of people would cry as well. But what Chris did was he made the workforce a top 3 strategic priority, which is awesome to hear, when we took the poll earlier today, that it's already a top 3 strategic priority for you. For Chris, what this meant was he chose the Trust Index, which is the most taken employee survey worldwide, the most researched one, for measurement. And he did this because his board was really cantankerous. They were losing lots of money, failures left and right. There was enough data that ties this to results that his board could get behind it. So he did this, and tactically, a few things that they did. They used the data. So Ron this morning says data is where we're all going, right? And it's how we use the data that matters. So they used this data to identify the gaps in where the employees were feeling. And in the data on our industry so far, there is a massive gap, usually 10 or 20 points, between the home office and the average for the field. So there are lots of gaps, and it's great data to have, but really data doesn't do anything, right? It's when you actually focus on what the top gaps are to work on. So they chose 3 of the 4 of them. Which one did they not choose? Which gap did they not choose? Pay. Yes, because remember the $20 million in operating losses? They didn't have any money. And in fact, they didn't have any money to do the other 3. But what underscores is a lot of this work doesn't take money, right? On pay, let me just do a side note. What they did over a couple years is they looked at their benefits package, and because they have 13,000 employees, they offered some benefits that were free to offer, such as going to see a movie earlier than everyone else. So giving employees the opportunity to do that, and that was a huge benefit that it really raised their benefits score. So creative ways like that. And then the last thing is then they worked on the core drivers behind these gaps. And what was the main core driver? It's going to be the same for our organizations too. The leaders, right? So they looked at the 700 managers in the organization. And this is a very complex graph, so we won't go through it. But of the 2-bar groupings, the one on the left is budget, that it goes to pay. And then the right is the turnover. So you can see the managers that are the top quartile leaders in the organization get better results in terms of turnover and spend less money doing it. Takeaway here is the top managers spent less and got more. And the research is really, really clear on this across industries, and from the few months of work that we've been doing here in senior living, also the case. And the trust index did jump. It jumped from under 50% to a score of 78. Now, if your organization has done this, you'll know what your score is, so you can see relative to Chris how things are. Remember that group of CNAs that had unionized? After a couple years, the CNAs got it together and actually asked the union to leave. So it makes such a big difference. On the patient satisfaction front, I looked up Chris's organization recently, 94th percentile in the market, which is great. And the first-year turnover dropped by 2/3. I mean, we showed just one view of the data from our industry, right? And you can see that it matters a lot. So what's important here is a lot of the naysayers say that if you have money, if you're Google, who has for a long time been number 2 on the Great Place to Work rankings list published by Fortune, if you're Google, you have enough money to spend on free everything for your employees, and then they're going to be happy, right? But it actually doesn't work that way. It's when a company has focused on the employees, then success comes. And it's been shown, there's a great TED Talk on this data about it. So look at the yellow line is Chris's score on the trust index, this one number, and you see it trends up, and then watch what happens to his profits. So the score goes up, and there's a negative 20 million in profits, goes up. And this is relevant to our organizations because as employee engagement increased, the number of call-outs decreased. And the amount of spent on agencies and overtime, which is quite a lot sometimes or often, decreased, and profits could go up. Then you can do more programs. It wasn't actually about pay. They never went and did a universal pay adjustment. And the profits keep going up. So that when healthcare reform happened, everyone on the bus was aligned, and they won market share from their competitors. So I'm so excited about this because Great Place to Work Institute, which is the data science behind the Fortune list, is, as if you don't know, is publishing the inaugural Best Workplaces in Aging Services this fall. Yay! And I loved what Ken said last night, right, of Harley, that when you create positive recognition, there's demand. In our case, it'll be demand in terms of applications for jobs, and it also helps. We've worked with some organizations where it helps on the resident side as well, that they see it's a great place to work and therefore better care. So what's interesting here is that many organizations in this room have applied in the past to Great Place to Work and the Fortune Best Places to Work, but never gotten it, right? Because it's hard to compete against the Mayo Clinics, the Cleveland Clinics of the world. But what's really incredible about this opportunity is that it is just us. So we are going to be recognized positively as an industry, and we'll have that data and the scores to identify the gaps and go through this process of being a great place to work and a great industry to work. So, did we do what we wanted to today? Sweat a little? Get some conversations going? And hopefully learn some things as well. Great. Thank you.